Today marks the third and final part of a special 3-part series I recorded with Christine Marsiglio of the WSET. Christine has previously assessed a Prosecco in episode 263 and a Cava in episode 264, and today she assesses a Champagne. Please see below for the details of the Champagne that we tasted, as well as links to WSET resources for the diploma, including the Level 4 Standardised approach to tasting wine. At the end of the tasting, Christine also includes some additional tips to help you prepare for the exam, so do listen right to the end. Enjoy!
So we are going to talk about Champagne now, which is some people's favorite topic. I think it's obviously a very well-known style of wine in the UK, but throughout the world. So we'll do a little bit of an introduction about Champagne. So it's very difficult to grow grapes in this region because it's actually really quite cool, and so vintage variation can be quite apparent in some cases. So that's why blending is really very important in Champagne. And that's why you see a lot of non-vintage styles in Champagne, because you need to keep some of your reserve wines back in order to help balance out those differences in vintages. So if you have a grand marque, such as, say, Veuve Clicquot or Moët Chandon, when people buy that, when they buy the non-vintage, they expect that style of wine to taste the same year in, year out. And that can be very, very difficult to produce in such a marginal climate, such as Champagne. So that's something to always have in the back of your mind when you're learning and tasting, learning about and tasting Champagne. Some more information about Champagne. The grape varieties that are used here are quite classic that many people will know. So Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier make up 99% of the production in Champagne. Many people will have heard of Chardonnay or Pinot Noir before, but not necessarily Pinot Meunier. We'll go into the different flavors and aromas that the different grape varieties bring to the wine when we taste this next wine. So just before we go into the different aging requirements that you might find in Champagne, it's also important to really think about Champagne as one large region. It's a very large region, and any grapes grown there that are then made in the méthode champenoise, or the traditional method, can be called Champagne. And it's very rare that you would see, say, sub-regions or villages on a bottle of Champagne. In some cases, you might see a Grand Cru if all of those grapes have come from that specific Grand Cru. But that's actually quite rare because, again, as we've said before, blending not just different vintages, but from different sites and different villages and different grape varieties is so important in order to have consistency, especially in these non-vintage styles of wine. And just as a little aside and something that's quite interesting, as people become more interested in single vineyard sites and of places of origin, we are seeing more of a focus on single estate and single vineyard champagnes, which hasn't really been the case in the past. So that's something to be aware of as a student, but also just interesting to know as a consumer in general. So when we are talking about different styles of Champagne, there are a couple of different styles to be aware of. So you can have normal white sparkling wine, which is what many people think of when they think of Champagne. And in most cases, that's going to be a non-vintage. So a blend of a number of different vintages with a minimum aging of 15 months. So every Champagne that you will find, even the most basic Champagne, will have some kind of autolytic aroma. And by autolytic, we mean bread or dough or yeast or brioche. And that's because it's spent time, a minimum amount of time of 15 months on the lees. When we look at vintage styles, here we're looking at a minimum aging of 36 months, so 3 years. So vintage champagnes will have a much more intense autolytic aroma than you would see with, say, a non-vintage style. Now, that is the minimum that is required. However, most vintage champagnes we're really looking at more like 5, in some cases even 10 years of lees aging before they're disgorged. And in those cases, you'll have very intense, complex secondary. And because they've been aging in bottle for so long, you'll also have intense tertiary aromas as well. One of the reasons why these wines can age for so long is because of their very, very high levels of acidity. And that acidity is coming from the fact that these grapes are grown in such a cool climate. So that gives longevity to the wines as well. Other than non-vintage versus vintage, you might see Blanc de Blanc or Blanc de Noir on a label. Blanc de Blanc means that the wine is made from 100% white grapes. In most cases, it's going to be 100% Chardonnay. Pinot Blanc is allowed, though it's not frequently used. A Blanc de Blanc will have very high levels of acidity because Chardonnay is bringing quite high levels of acidity to any blend, or in this case, 100% Chardonnay will be very high levels of acidity with kind of chalky flavors and lemon and citrus fruit flavors as well. A Blanc de Noir means that the wine is created from 100% black grapes, so Pinot Noir and or Pinot Meunier, or a blend of the two. The acidity will still be very high with a Blanc de Noir, but it won't be as austere as you would expect with a Blanc de Blanc. You can also get rosé champagnes, either as non-vintage or vintage as well. And there are a couple of different ways that they can be made. The traditional way is that a red wine would be produced, and that would be blended with your white base wine to create a rosé. And that's actually a very unique way of doing things. That's Champagne is the only place that is allowed to do that. Normally, if you're making a rosé, it has to be done through direct pressing or short maceration. Some producers in Champagne will do short maceration in order to get that color, though it is not as common as the blending of red and white wines. There's a lot more to talk about with Champagne, but I think in some cases it's best to walk through the wine, and then you can really talk about where the grapes are coming from, what grapes are used, and the method of production, which is so key here in Champagne. So the wine that we're tasting today is the Pol Roger Brut Reserve. So it's a non-vintage, so it's a blend of different vintages. And first of all, we're going to look at the color. So this is clear pale lemon with some bubbles, some small fine bubbles. And then if we give this a swirl and a smell, it's clean and it's actually quite pronounced. So there's a lot of aroma coming out of this glass. And the first thing that we smell is actually secondary aromas. And it's really quite autolytic. So a lot of brioche, dough, bread, biscuit. If you look at your SAT as a diploma student and you look on the back on the lexicon under yeast or autolysis, you see biscuit, bread, toast, pastry, brioche, bread dough. I think any of those is a good descriptor for the secondary aromas of this wine. So there's a lot of secondary notes here. And though this is a non-vintage, which means it would only have to spend 15 months on the lees, Pol Roger Champagne House has chosen to age this for a minimum of 4 years. So that is giving this really intense brioche note to the wine. Now, under the secondary autolytic notes, we also have some fruit coming through. And the fruit flavors that we're finding are citrus. So we've got some lemon. We've got some green apple as well. So citrus, green fruit. So green apple, maybe a hint of pear. A little bit of lemon peel and lemon zest. But you can see that they're really focused on the green fruit and the citrus fruit rather than the stone fruit that we found in, say, a cava. And again, this is all relating back to the very cool climate up here in Champagne. So the warmer it gets, the more tropical or maybe stone fruit you get. But here, because it's such a cool climate, it's really focused on green and citrus fruit and maybe just a hint floral aromas as well. And if we look at the assemblage, or the blend of this wine, it's 1/3 of each of the main grape varieties. So a third Pinot Noir, a third Pinot Meunier, and a third Chardonnay. And what those grape varieties are bringing is that the Pinot Noir is going to bring a little bit of structure and body to the wine. The Pinot Meunier tends to be used for earlier drinking wines because it brings a lot of fruitiness and roundness. And then you have the Chardonnay, which is bringing a lot of acidity. And some people believe it brings finesse to the wine. So this wine is a blend of all three of those grape varieties. Okay, so we've got quite a lot of we've got mostly secondary notes with some of our primary aromas as well. But if we also go back to the nose and smell it, this definitely has had some bottle age, because what's coming through is there's a bit of that kind of marzipan, a little bit of almond, just a hint of maybe hazelnut as well. And that's coming from bottle age. So this wine was aged on the lees for 4 years. So not only are we getting the autolytic notes coming from that, but we're also getting the tertiary aromas too. So this is a quite complex, intense wine, and we can tell that just from the nose. Okay. Again, because with sparkling wine, many of them will have some sort of dosage, unless it's a Brut nature or a zero dosage. It's very important to, again, dip your tongue in to test for the level of sugar. So here we do taste a bit of sweetness. So just a hint. And this is a Brut wine, so that means it's going to range from 0 to 12 grams per liter. In fact, this is 9 grams per liter. So it's not as high as you would expect for some champagnes. And in fact, dosage levels tend to be falling, because one, people don't like as much sugar in their wine for health reasons or for taste purposes, but also with climate change, because acidity levels aren't necessarily as high as they used to be, the need for dosage has gone down. So while before you would maybe find dosage levels closer to 12, now we're seeing more 8 and 9. And actually the prevalence of Brut nature or zero dosage has really gone up. One, because it's fashionable, but again, because it's easier to have a balanced wine without that dosage because of the warming climate, which is actually quite helpful for those in Champagne, but not so much for other parts of the world. Okay, so we're going to actually taste the wine now. So this would be considered off dry because of that 9 grams per liter of Brut dosage. And it's really important to check for acidity as well with sparkling wines, because sometimes that sugar can mask the acidity. So it's really important to do the dribble test. So here, the acidity level is quite high. So we would note this as high level of acidity. And again, that's coming from the grape varieties that have been used. So Chardonnay here is bringing quite a lot of acidity, but also the cool climate. There's another point with the production of wine here where we're going to find higher levels of acidity. When the grapes are pressed, and in Champagne they must be hand harvested and whole bunch pressed, there are 2 different main press fractions. The first is called the cuvée, and the second is called the taille. And again, when we're blending, when the producer is blending, they will decide how much of the cuvée and how much of the taille they will use. The cuvée, which is the first 2,050 liters coming from the press, will have much higher levels of acidity, and the taille will have less. So now that extra level of acidity is going to give longevity to the wine. So the cuvée tends to be used more for vintage wines than, say, non-vintage, and the taille will be used for those that are meant for earlier drinking. Now, we don't have the notes on how much of the cuvée versus the taille was used for this wine, but it does have very high levels of acidity, and they did age it on the lees for at least 4 years. So probably they were using a large percentage of the cuvée in this case. But that's something to be aware of as a student, as part of the method of production. Another thing that's happened to this base wine, and that's quite common in Champagne, is that it's gone through 100% malolactic fermentation. And again, in Champagne, they have the opposite problem that they have in, say, Cava. In Cava, they're really trying to retain the acidity that they have, whereas in Champagne, acidity levels are so high that you want to put the wine through malolactic fermentation to help soften that acidity. That's also going to give some roundness and some extra body to the wine too, which we can taste here. And actually, this is a medium plus body wine with a medium level of alcohol. So we've got an off-dry palate with high levels of acidity, medium alcohol, and medium plus body. You can taste it has almost a creamy texture as well, and that's coming from the lees aging, but also from that malolactic fermentation. Most producers are going to put their wine through malolactic fermentation. Lanson is an example of one that does not put their wines through malolactic fermentation, and that's a stylistic choice. Just going back to the wine, we just have to taste for flavor intensity and check for the finish as well. So just as on the nose, we had pronounced intensity aromas. Here, there's quite a lot of pronounced flavor as well. That the fruit is coming through more on the palate. You still get a lot of the secondary autolytic notes of bread and brioche, but now you're really picking up the lemon and almost some grapefruit, a little bit of blossom, pear, a hint of peach perhaps as well. So there's a lot of flavor, and some of that nuttiness is coming through as well. So we still have our primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas on the palate. And you really do pick up that kind of creaminess that's coming from the lees aging, but also from that malolactic fermentation. Now, that flavor, that kind of breadiness, this steeliness as well, there's a real steeliness to this wine, is really lasting a long time. So this has a clear, long finish. So a long finish. One interesting thing before we get to the quality assessment for this wine, when it comes to disgorgement, there is the choice of using gyro pellets or hand riddling. Now, hand riddling is the traditional way. It takes a long time and it uses manual labor. Gyro pellets are much faster and much more inexpensive than hand riddling. This specific wine and this house in particular still does most of its riddling by hand. So the remuage is done by hand. And interesting fact, a person can riddle 40,000 bottles a day, which is, I think, quite impressive. Not that has an impact on the quality. It's just an interesting kind of harkening back to the past, which is a nice tradition to keep. So when we do look at the quality of this wine objectively, we have to think about the finish, if that sugar and acid is balanced, how intense the wine was, how complex it is, if it's typical of the region. We can look at the finish. We said that it was a long finish. Now, it does have very high levels of acidity, but I think that dosage, that 9 grams per liter of dosage, is really helping to soften that acidity. So we can say that it's actually very well balanced. Lots of primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas point to a complex wine with high levels of intensity both on the nose and the palate. Now, when you smell and taste this, you really say, yes, this is a champagne. That high level of acidity, those really intense autolytic aromas, there's almost this austerity about it as well, means that it's quite typical for the region. So this is really ticking all the boxes for our quality assessment, and we would come to the conclusion that this is an outstanding wine. If we look for the readiness for drinking and the potential for aging, it's drinking very well right now. However, because of that really high level of acidity, it could improve with age, becoming a little bit more nutty over a short period of time. Non-vintage wines are meant to be drunk pretty much on release. However, if you do like that kind of nutty, slightly more oxidized style, then you can hold it for a few years in your cellar. This wine has a little bit more of that kind of tertiary aroma as well, because they've used 25% reserve wines, which is actually a very high percentage for a non-vintage. And that's bringing extra complexity to this wine as well.
Yeah, huge thank you again. That was fascinating. I've learned so much in this champagne exploration, but also in the other explorations you've done of Cava and Prosecco. So yeah, thank you so much. Again, I just invite you to say something a little bit about I invite you to say something about the theory element of the exam.
Sure. There's quite a lot to know about Champagne, not just the production, which is traditional method, but the different grapes, also the different subregions which grow those different grape varieties. So, knowing the differences between the Vallée de Marne and the Côte des Blancs and Montagne de Reims, these areas, and which grapes they focus on is important. Knowing the climate, the difference between Cuvée and Thai, also the different levels of quality that we spoke about and the minimum requirements for each. Knowing some Grand Marque, what a Grand Marque is, for example, so Veuve Clicquot, Moet Chandon, but also knowing about growers and the structure of the industry there. So, who ages wine, who is a négociant, how the structure works in Champagne is really important for knowing about the different marketplaces there and where the wines are sold and how the wines are sold. So these are all very interesting things to learn about. So it's not just the method of production and what the wines taste like, but the structure of the business that is Champagne. Learning some resources to learn more about that. Obviously, you have the WSET website and also the Oxford Companion to Wine. So visiting the CIVC website, which stands for the Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin de Champagne, is a very helpful resource to visit as well, which goes not just through the production and the grapes and the regions, but also the structure of the wine business from there. Specific websites for producers will also give you quite a lot of information. Not just the structure and how the wines are made, but also how viticulture happens in Champagne. So certain vine training methods that are used there is important to look at too.
Seeing as we've now arrived at the third part of our three-part series here, I think it's a good point to ask you just to talk about tasting, I guess, and identifying the differences between these three styles that we've covered across the three.
Yeah, for sure. It's during the tasting exam, the first question that you really should be thinking is which of these, if any, is tank method or traditional method. So the first thing you want to think about is, do I smell autolysis? So is there any note of bread or dough or yeast? If so, that's pointing to fermentation in bottle. Now, that could be traditional method or that could be the transfer method, but that is going to get you places. So that's going to take you away. If you have notes of secondary aromas, then that's taking you away from Prosecco. It's obviously not going to be a tank method sect. So then you can start looking into, is it Champagne? Is it Cava? These kinds of options. So that's the first thing to look at. Then really think about the level of acidity that you have. If it's a really, really high level of acidity, that's probably pointing to a cooler climate, such as Champagne. If you have really ripe fruit aromas, so if we're looking more at peach, stone fruit, maybe even some tropical fruit flavors, that's probably not coming from a cool climate, such as Champagne. It's probably looking at somewhere a little bit warmer, maybe Cava, or maybe a high quality sparkling from the New World, such as Australia or even California. So you have to look at the mixture of the level of acidity, if you have any secondary aromas, and what kind of primary aromas that you have, either kind of cool climate or warm climate aromas. And that's going to point you in the right direction of what kind of style of wine you might be tasting. The quality level will also give you a hint. If it's a very high quality level, then it could be a Champagne, but that's not the only place that high quality sparkling comes from. You can also get that from various places in the New World, also in parts of Italy, and of course Cava can be very high quality as well, especially if it's in the Reserva or Gran Reserva kind of levels that we've talked about today. The other important thing to think about, once you've thought about the primary, secondary, and maybe if there's tertiary aromas, and you've thought about the quality and maybe what kind of grapes you have, obviously before you've had any of that, look at the color. if it's a red sparkling wine, there are very few things that could be. Maybe a sparkling Shiraz or a Lambrusco. If the wine is sweet as well, there are very few truly sweet sparkling wines. Asti is one of them. So try not to limit yourself to just thinking about champagne or Prosecco or Cava. Remember, there are other styles that you'll be expected to know for your exam. If you are unsure about which wines that you would be expected to know for your exam, make sure you check out your specification that you can find online, or that you probably would have received when you first got your materials when you signed up for the diploma course, because there it will tell you what kinds of wine you would be expected to know for your tasting exam.
Thank you so much once again to Christine. Another very comprehensive tasting today of champagne. If you missed either of the previous assessments, do be sure to go back and look at episode 263 for Prosecco and episode 264 for Cava. It's only left for me to say a huge thank you once again to Christine and all of the team at the WSET in London. As ever, I have left below the website and main social media handles for the WSET. This is certainly the best place to start in order to find out more about the courses that they offer, both in person and online. And of course, I would love to have you following along with me on social media. I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.